Hello, hello. Good morning, modern sales pros. Welcome to the very first day of the Megasco, our 3-day community kickoff summit. Today's event is brought to you by the team at Modern Sales Pros. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest and highest quality revenue leadership community. Our mission is to create an environment for our members to answer the toughest revenue questions out there. And if you're not a member yet, we'll invite you after this event, and I hope you join. All right, so this summit and all of our events would not be possible without our amazing partners who you see on this next slide. So snaps, kudos, claps to all of them for making this happen. You see, we've got some awesome logos on there, and these sponsors aren't only sponsoring this specific event, but all 3 days of our summit. So if you want to learn more about them, click on the Booths tab at the top of your page right here. Check out all of the ungated and valuable resources that our sponsors have made available just for us this week. So definitely go in there. All right. So this week's summit will be full with the latest do's and don'ts for your 2022 SKOs, whether you're in sales, marketing, customer success, or product. There's going to be content for you. And this is our very first event of our very first day of the summit. So after this event, we'll have our VC panel on sales tech investing, and then we'll finish our day with a panel on mastering prospecting. And tomorrow, we've got a set of amazing events for you. And Thursday, same thing. So you're in for a wild ride. Definitely click on the agenda tab at the top of your page if you want to see the full schedule events, and you can see what's coming up next so you don't miss anything. Okay, so here is our agenda for this session. I'll go over some quick housekeeping notes. The speakers are going to do an introduction of themselves, tell you how awesome they all are. They'll get into the content. We'll answer some live Q&A, and then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. But before we dive into the content, let's just go over some quick housekeeping notes. So first, this event is being recorded. You'll be able to access this recording and the key takeaways on the summit page of the MSP website following this event. And if you have a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A function on the right side. It's a little bit confusing because you have to toggle between chat and Q&A, but definitely ask your questions there so that we can get them answered live. Also, chat is wide open, so please do interact with each other. Say hi to our speakers. What did you think about a point that was just made? Do you disagree? Do you agree? Definitely let us know. All right, so let's get started. The one and only Andy Mowat will be our moderator for today. So Andy, I'm going to hand it off to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Chuck and Mike. I've built the demand gen at 3 unicorns, and today I'm working to create incentives for senders to invest in quality content. Today, we're lucky to have 3 of the sharpest demand gen leaders I know, and we're here to discuss where content is today and where it's going. Let me do some quick introductions, and then we'll get into it. So John Miller has defined account-based marketing at Marketo, Engagio, and now Demandbase. Doug Landis, I've had the honor of working with him at Box. His SKOs are legendary, so you folks are lucky to have him on your mega SKO. And he's led sales enablement at Salesforce and Box and is now on the VC side. And Sean Murray has leveraged content as he's led some amazing sales teams. Today, Sean is CRO at Greenhouse, and he has previous roles including CRO at SalesLoft. So guys, we talked about how we wanted this panel to push the thinking around content. We all know we can get up here and talk about how sales and marketing need to work better together and some of those tactics to make content impactful. But let's talk first about what's your most controversial perspective on content. What do you believe about content that you think no one else believes? Sean, let me go ahead and turn it over to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And before I get going, thank you to the MSP team for putting together this event. Can't wait to dive in. It's a great question, Andy. We've been talking about this quite a bit. And I don't believe this to be too big of an insight yet. Perhaps some controversy comes with how much time buyers are spending researching independently. According to Gartner, to the tune of 45% of their entire sales process buying process is done on their own. So to my colleagues in MSP, if you're not injecting more of your future customer or customer feedback in the content generation process, you're making a big mistake. It's very important now to understand what they are buying, what they are not buying. Buyer remorse is also skyrocketing, which is good news for us as sellers. We're not completely isolated, but we've got to incorporate their voice.
That's powerful. I'm excited when we get later in to talk about how buyer-led is changing sales. John, how about you? What do you see that's maybe controversial or push our thinking around content?
Yeah, I've got two controversial opinions. I think the first one is, content gets used at every stage of the buyer's journey. Even if you have an opportunity that the sales rep thinks that they prospected and created themselves, that buyer probably interacted with some of your content, along the way. And because of this and a whole bunch of other dynamics, I think we need to just get rid of the whole notion of sales source pipeline or marketing source pipeline. We all care about just having enough pipeline. Each AE should be the quarterback of their territory. Ultimately, the AE is responsible to make sure there's enough pipeline for him or her to make their number. But it's a whole company effort to drive it. So that's one is, maybe not so controversial if everybody's happy about it, but get rid of marketing source pipeline. The other one is, where should content sit in the organization? Usually it's in marketing, not always, but often, although sometimes there's a sales enablement component. And I've seen content sit inside demand gen because you can use content to create pipeline. I've seen it sit inside of product marketing because product marketers create sales tools. And I've seen it sit inside corporate marketing because content helps create your brand. The reality is it does all three of those. So my other controversial opinion is that content should be its own fourth function in the marketing team. And that's how I've organized my team at Demandbase. A VP of demand gen, VP of corporate marketing, VP of content marketing, VP of product marketing, and a VP of content marketing.
That's amazing. Content often can get ignored or lost when you're starting to move fast in marketing, John. So that resonates with me. Doug,
wait. Before I even jump into mine, John, I have a million questions now. Now, hold on a second. By the way, I love what you said. I wholeheartedly agree. Not surprising. However, product marketing and content marketing, how do they live and work together? That's my question. Because if you're going to create a separate function for content marketing, which I totally agree with, but oftentimes product marketers feel like that's a huge part of their job, right? To take what the narrative around the product and the feature set and the fit and the pricing and packaging, and then create assets for the masses. So how do they work with a content marketer?
We, at least at Demandbase,
sorry, Andy, I just jumped in.
We treat our product marketing team primarily as the subject matter experts, but they're not necessarily writers or video creators or things like that. So that's the first piece. And the second piece is we do have our product marketing team does make like the pitch deck and the solutions sheet and like things that are, I think, much more, and they write the web pages, but that are much more kind of like sales collateral. But content, generally speaking, I feel like it's its own function. And you're talking about how product marketing and content marketing sit, but I've seen content sit under corporate marketing just as often. So you would still have that same issue.
Yeah,
so
that's a good point. That's a really good point. I trust me, I love the distinction of it because, to your point, content lives across the entire organization, not just sales at all. And it's not even just a part of marketing. It's actually a huge part of product and product engineering. How are we thinking about getting this out to market when you're building products? My kind of hot take around the notion of content, which is kind of building on both what Sean and John was just sharing, is I think one of the things that we get wrong with content is we think that content is kind of the end all be all. It's like, oh, if I just share the right piece of content at the right time, it's going to help me move this deal forward. Or this is what's going to get them to pay more attention to me or choose us over our competitor, et cetera. But the reality is we cannot forget this. And I've got to give my buddy John Barrows some credit to this, because at the end of the day, we all think that content is king, right? So it's like, that's what I'm saying. Content's king. Make sure you get the best piece of content. I'll tell you what, if you believe that, then the reality is context is God. Because if you don't have context around the piece of content itself, then you have no idea what to do with that piece of content. The number one thing that I see most organizations struggle with is they create these great pieces of content and nobody knows how to use it or what to do with it or how to talk about it or how to even share it in an email or share it on a post on LinkedIn. It's just like, you take and John, I'd be curious, your VP of content marketing is like, well, how do they help people understand how to use the content that we're creating for both sellers or customer success or even marketers? That to me is the context is so often missed when it comes to a piece of content, and that's where I think things start to fall apart. The wheels start to fall off.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that, I think, in the next question.
Sean, you had a point?
Yeah, let me jump in. I love what Doug said. Love the JB shout out as well. Let me ask you this, Doug. When we think through the context, let's go back to the comment I made earlier, where even as far as into the enterprise, when buyers are doing so much of their independent research on their own, how should we think about grabbing their attention? We don't even know where they are or what they're doing. There's some incredible intent data out there that can help. But I want to attach that context comment, because when you have content out in the market, and we're trying to build content now that's hitting buyers mid-cycle at some point, because we don't know that they're actually shopping. So how do we get that context when we don't know what's going on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it boils down to knowing who your buyers are and knowing who the people are who are going to be looking for your content, looking for assets, looking for information about you, the market, the company, the industry, what have you. The more you know and understand your buyers and your personas, the more you can start to connect to them. And I think one of the important things is connecting to them with simple language.
Yeah.
For all you marketers out there, John, no offense, we tend to get so wrapped up in like our own speak, our own language, and we lose sight of the fact that as a buyer, if I'm just glancing at something, I have to translate that in my own brain when I see it, regardless of where I am in the journey. And often things get lost in translation. Great movie, by the way, if you haven't seen it. But that's a big part of the context is often some of it's language, the language that we use and the language we speak. The other piece is we're not directing it to the right personas. Right. So it's being mindful of the entire process and who's involved in all the stages, and then sharing kind of your thoughts and your insight and your learnings.
I'm almost feeling like we need a user testing for content, right? I think you're so right, which is when we write something, we're filling in all the blanks and filling in all the holes. But when a buyer or a prospect or somebody that's not even in a buying cycle is getting this stuff, like they have none of that context. And so if you can keep it simple and I'd love to be able to say, hey, great, here's some MarTech buyers that know nothing about my tool. Let me have them read our content, which I think is so missed, right? You've got people who are just in this bubble writing content a lot of the time.
Absolutely. And that is a big piece of it.
Sorry, I want to build on what Doug was talking about, context and relevance, because the persona is so important, but I also think that the journey stage is so important. And the content that somebody who isn't even in market for your solution, right? Yeah. The content that you're going to use to connect and engage them is completely different from the content from somebody who may be showing intent, which is different from somebody who's in an active buying cycle, and so it's that this is content 101, but it's that two-dimensional grid, right, of persona and stage, buying stage. And Sean, I think, mentioned things like intent data, which is so powerful to know when people are kind of entering that in-market stage, and even to tell you what topics they're interested in. So it kind of all connect together.
Yeah, I agree. But oftentimes, do you see? I've seen this many times where you have, and I think Sean, you just mentioned this, but you've got someone who's in a content function creating content or writing content without any experience. They don't understand what a buyer's journey is like, or where the buyer might be, right? And they don't understand the difference between building content to build the brand versus building content for driving an opportunity in cycle, right? Which is very different.
I think that's on us as content leaders to help make sure that they understand that that's different and important, and not saying that's easy, but totally agreed. Super important.
Let's shift gears to kind of like how do we know if our content is working, right? We all put a lot of money and a lot of investment into content. We've all got teams of people crafting content, but how do you judge it? Sean, let's maybe take your perspective as a sales leader. How do you know if you've got the right content and it's making impact? And how do you know like when to raise the flag if it's not?
Yeah, great question, Andy. Thanks for asking. And key word was perspective. I wish I had the right answer. So let me share some perspective. There are three immediate areas where I go to measure the effectiveness of the content. So first, internally, our enablement, certification, our pass rates. Can our people, getting back to Doug's point, is it simple where it's easy to sell and easy to buy? So first, the certification pass rates. Is it going to work internally? Second, is the content actually getting used? Are we using that content? There's software obviously that can measure how much we're using of which content. So are we using it and where? And then the third is buyer satisfaction. I know that's a bit lagging. It's a bit later in the cycle. But the reason why I find that so important is I'm trying to wrestle with some of the unknown, because we do know that as our buyers are doing so much on their own right now with their remorse of what they bought, that's up year on year on year. So are we giving them the right messaging? Are we giving them the right content at various stages, as John had mentioned, in their journey stages? What's the sentiment of the buyer once they purchase your product or service? Did they get what they thought that they wanted? So those are the three areas I go to quickly.
Those are fascinating. They're like, you find those like proxy measurements. They're all lagging indicators, which is kind of indicates the challenge of measuring content as well too. John, as a marketing leader, same question. Like, how do you know if you're getting the right content to all the different teams that need it?
Yeah, I want to answer this by just kind of double click into that concept of different content for the different stages. It's easy to think about it just as like top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel, and post sale. But Gartner has some research on the 6 questions that any buyer needs to answer before they can actually make a purchase decision. And sorry, let me validate. Any buying committee needs to answer before they can make a purchase decision. Just real quickly, it's problem identification. Do we need to do something? Then it's second, solution exploration. Hey, what are the tools out there to solve our problem? Third is requirements building. What exactly do we need it to do? Fourth is then supplier selection. Who do we want to pick? And then the last 2 are really interesting. Fifth is validation. Like, hey, we think we know the right answer, but buyer's remorse, so let's make sure we're sure. And then lastly, and really important, is consensus creation. How do we get that whole buying committee on board? I think that's a great checklist to think about your content, and do you have content that is actually being used in market, that ties to each of those 6 questions? And if you don't, buy persona. And if you don't, that should be your content roadmap. That should guide what you need to be building and creating.
I think it's so powerful. I'm really excited to click in a little bit later on around how how PLG changes this, right? Because if you've got the product, your whole decision process has been a little bit flipped. But I totally agree with you.
You still need to answer the same questions.
I totally agree with John. Totally agree with John with that.
You might do your requirements building while using the product a little bit. So I guess the order might swap a little bit, but the questions still need to be answered.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering
the order's still the same.
If the product answers them, or if the content itself is no longer needed, if you've got your hands on the product for maybe 1 or 2 of those questions. But I think you're right. The questions still need to be answered, and maybe that means the product needs to be more aligned with content than it's ever been in the past.
Yeah. I think one other thing, Sean, I'm going to build on something that Sean was talking about earlier, as far as like, how do you know if content's working? Whether or not you know this, 2 things are always exist when it comes to content. By the way, this is coming from Boxy, Andy, as you and I both experienced this. All of these repositories of incredible content, whether it's HighSpot, Box, Notion, Coda, Google Docs, whatever the hell system you're using, you need 2 things. Number 1, you need an owner for every single piece of content to ensure that that piece of content is validated, it's up to date, and it's being used. And second, you need a system for archiving all the stuff that's not being used, because as sellers, half the times we go to look for something and we can't find it, And so guess what? Like, we don't ever touch it, and we go back to what we're used to and comfortable with. I mean, back in the day when Andy and I were at Box, it'd be like, we'd walk around, we'd have this great new message, this new pitch deck, and all these great assets, and we'd hear the reps going like, "Oh yeah, we're just cloud storage." We're like, "Oh, shoot me in the head." It's because oftentimes content just doesn't get used because either they can't find it or it's just not being updated.
That's such a killer, Doug. That's all these systems are built for a lot of it, but they miss the ownership of it, which is so critical.
Yeah, validation piece.
Doug, let's shift to a topic that you can't have a session on content without, which is alignment. I think we, as organizations start to scale, it gets harder and harder to tell a coordinated message. Doug, as you've really thought through, you mentioned that you focus on integration rather than alignment, which is an interesting take to me. I'd love to hear kind of how you get teams executing well together on content. Well,
I mean, this is actually it's kind of broader than just content. I mean, I don't believe in sales and marketing alignment. In fact, John was alluding to this in the very beginning. I believe in sales and marketing integration. I believe in actually go-to-market integration because it's sales, marketing, and customer success. And largely, I believe it's company integration because it's product engineering, sales, marketing, customer success. And underneath all that is HR, right? But what integration basically means is we're all on the same team with the same goal in mind, which is to take care of our customers. And of course, if we do that well, we're going to drive more revenue. Oftentimes, marketing has their goals over here. It's like, oh, I'm just generating leads, and sales over here is I'm just closing business, and customer success is over here. And it's like, oh, I'm just trying to keep our customers happy and get them to renew. And there's no connective tissue between all of that. The connective tissue is the target. We all have the same revenue target. We all have the same net dollar retention target, by the way, which is probably the second most important metric that we should all care about. And then we need to, when you start thinking about ownership, and we all own those numbers, then you can start to think about, well, how does content help to drive that? How does what marketing is creating, how does that help us to better serve our customers on the sales side? And then what we're using on the sales side, how are we sharing that with customer success to ensure that our customers are happy and they're implemented and they're going to continue to renew? If we have the mindset of like what our end goals are taking care of our customers, driving revenue, keeping our net dollar retention or keeping our customers buying more from us, then it actually makes creating a content strategy a little easier versus having these little silos. That's why I use integration versus alignment, because oftentimes alignment is like, John, I'm going to pick on you because you're the marketer in the team here, but it's like, John comes to our executive, our ELT meeting, and he's like, here's what we're doing in marketing. And then Sean's over here. And by the way, as a board member, I hear this a lot. And then Sean's over here going, well, we're doing this over here. And it's like, wait a minute, how are you two not, how are you two not on the same page right now? Because as the company grows and scales and gets bigger, it starts to happen.
I have an analogy I like better. I mean, integration's, I think, a perfectly good word, but I like using an analogy to kind of explain it, which is like a football team or a soccer team, which is you have sales people and you have marketers. They are on the same team and they're working towards the same goal, but they do play different positions.
Of course.
Right? Your forward strikers are not the same as your like defensive players, and I think it's important sometimes I think when people hear integration, they think we'll just smash the whole thing together. Right, as opposed to different positions, but let's work together as a team.
It's interesting. I've always found that the concept of board observer, which comes from your world, Doug, I kind of like as well too within leadership meetings, right? Like within a sales leadership meeting, if marketing or content doesn't have a seat, at least listening and engaging in that, oftentimes things can go in different directions. So I've always, when I was running ops cross-functionally, I always said, like, if my team's not attending the offsites of the sales and of the marketing, we're not going to have ops aligned and wired. And I think the same thing sits, which is like, if marketing's not sitting in and listening to what customer success is talking about or vice versa, I think things can go sideways a lot. Sean, you mentioned that software can help with alignment. I'm a big fan. There are also some limitations. I'm curious, like, how do you use software successfully to bring teams together on content?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And I couldn't agree more with Doug's sentiment on reshaping the sales and marketing integration, because as long as I've been in high growth sales environments, it's cliche to say, hey, you got to be tight with marketing. Sales got to be tight with marketing. It feels like so cliche to say it year over year over year over year. Yet with today's pandemic, it couldn't be more true. With the seller must learn marketing, and marketing must learn selling. And I view this integration as we are now the heads of selling versus the heads of, say, sellers. So completely agree with Doug's sentiment. Now, to the point on software, given our audience today, I don't want to make any assumptions on how much tech the broader audience is using. So when I go back maybe 10 years ago, before a lot of this cool technology helped us integrate more with our content, it was very difficult just using spreadsheets, meetings, docs, email. It just got lost in translation, to quote Doug from earlier. So we use a very heavy tech stack, not to overwhelm our budget spend on the technology itself, but there are some incredible companies out there that are helping make this process happen, which ultimately drives more positive business outcomes. So depending on what your CMS is, Slack, I know the majority of the group is probably using Slack and Channel to get the work done there. We use WorkRamp and various LMS solutions. My friends at SalesLoft, they do incredible work when activating a pipeline. Gong, we use Guru, nice emergence company. But there is just some incredible technology here that can really get this alignment and integration. Is that right? Where I know, John, what you're saying is, I like the analogy of the different players on the field. It's also a good one. But that helps with the integration. It's just leveraging a very heavy tech stack to make it happen.
Makes sense. I'm seeing a couple of fun questions in the Q&A, which we'll get to in a little while, around customer stories. Doug, you were the master of that box, of bringing stories to SKO and enablement. You said the other day when we were talking around customer stories are often the piece that gets missed. How do you make sure it doesn't?
Well, I mean, look, the reality with customer stories, as the former chief storyteller box, is they're often used at the tail end of a pitch, right? Your first call deck, it's at the very end, or they're used later stage. And my whole thesis around customer stories is they need to be a part of every single conversation you have, whether that's the very beginning when you're starting to identify who your customers might be, i.e. your prospects, all the way through to getting them to continue to renew and expand. Literally every single interaction you have with a customer or prospect should incorporate and include a customer story. Why? Because it does three things. It builds connection, credibility, and empathy. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to do as a company, is to say, hey, we think we get you. And as a result, we think we might be able to help. But oftentimes we put on our marketing hat or our sales hat and we say, let me tell you. And guess what?
Doug,
you have sales in your title, and most of the time people don't trust you. Sorry.
No, it's good. That first point you made was so powerful for me, which is stories always end things. I mean, I would much rather hear a story of a customer at the beginning that personalizes a sales process than getting one kind of thrown at the end to let me check that box. It's hard, but if you can do it well, I think it just engages and makes it makes the whole process much more differentiated. So that's a powerful point.
Think about how successful Challenger has been, right? The idea of teach, tailor, and take control. Sean, you know it all too well from CEB, you're back in the day. But at the end of the day, teaching, as a buyer, part of what gives us buyer's remorse is because we feel like we're on an island. Oh my gosh, I just made this big decision. There's a ton of risk. I'm out here on my own. If it fails, in which, by the way, I made 2 decisions at Box that almost got me fired. And I realized after that, I'm not making another decision. Done. Not going to happen. And so at the end of the day, when you start to share stories of people in roles, by the way, companies are not characters, so quit saying brands and company names because nobody gives a shit about that. People want a person in a role so that they can draw a comparison and they're like, wow, that feels really similar to me and this situation that I'm in, so I feel better and safer. Or they say people, misery loves company, as they say. If you could draw a comparison to from what I'm thinking and feeling and struggling with somebody else and how they got through that, it makes me feel a lot safer and better.
Couldn't agree more.
I love jump, and I want to underscore a lot of Yeah, I want to jump what Doug was saying and just underscore a lot of the key points. And because of the CEB call out, Gartner then suggested, based on their research, 17% of the entire buying experience is spent with potential suppliers. So during that 17%, you're also sharing that with your competitors that could be in the deal. So call it, you get about 9% of airtime with your potential buyer. So to Doug's point, the way that humans and the way our brains respond to absorbing information, your buyers has a much higher likelihood of absorbing the information if it's told through a story versus a data point, a feature, a piece of functionality. People remember the story because they can relate. They can relate to their own experience. So when you tailor, good challenger shout out, when you can tailor that story to an organization that looks and feels just like them, they're going to absorb it. So the customer story is very important. We use user voice at Greenhouse to capture the market, the sentiment, so we can then better shape and tell our stories from both problems that they're trying to solve, problems that they don't know that they should be solving and they need to go and solve, but just making it come to life. I love what Doug had said.
Facts fade, stories stick.
I think that I mean, the storytelling, I couldn't agree with more. I also really just like Sean introducing the challenger sale in the context of all this. You know, it's just such a good framework for just thinking about your content creation. You know, like in terms of, you know, what's relevant to somebody's business, right? And if this actually can teach them something and you can deliver in a way tailored to their business, that's going to be good content. It's a really good framework.
Powerful. Let's talk.
By the way, a question came in. Speaking of customer stories, I think it was Francisco. He said something to the effect of, "What's the best method, video, phone call, website for delivering customer stories?" All of them. Like the reality is a customer story. I think one of the things that people get lost in and John's absolutely right. You need you need a customer story for every persona across every stage of the buyer's journey. You need a handful of stories. And you need to be able to tell them in 30 seconds or less. They don't have to be long diatribes. You just have to understand the core storytelling mechanics and what needs to be included in your stories. Because, you know, they just work. And they're so much easier for us as buyers to understand. All of us have bought millions of dollars worth of software. I'll tell you what, when someone comes in, they start spewing up a bunch of bullets and facts and all this stuff. We all just get glazed over.
Dude, the other thing I've found that works really well is like, you can't just, you have to wire the generation of customer stories into the entire go-to-market process. Support, sales, CSM, marketing. If you're expecting marketing to do it all by themselves, I think it's tough. The companies I've seen that are most successful, and we're doing that at Gated, is every single part of the motion is built to like kick it up to G2 crowd, kick it up to testimonials, kick it up to like discussions, and then record those and leverage those recordings. So I think the people that kind of view content as a bolt-on versus content generation as part of the go-to-market process are missing out for sure. Let's talk briefly about mistakes that we've seen made in content and maybe ways we can fix them. John, I'm going to turn to you first. You cited a stat when we were talking around 60 to 70% of content is not used. Resonates deeply with me. How have you seen people fix this and address this problem?
Yeah, that stat's from Serious Decisions, now part of Forrester. I back to what we were talking about, product marketing and content marketing. I mean, I definitely see a lot of content, especially stuff that product marketing creates, that just doesn't get used. And I feel like they create it sometimes because they just sort of feel like, well, they have to. Like, you have to have a solution sheet. You have to have this, you know. And I think, you know, what I try to guide my team to, you know, is like literally go interview our best reps, you know, and literally like you know, what are they creating themselves? You know, what emails are they crafting for their customers, or competitive matrices, or, you know, how are they customized the pitches, you know, and then try to find a way to replicate that, or at least ask them, hey, this is awesome, best rep. what would you create if you had more time? And to try to use that as your roadmap, and it takes your product marketing in a very different direction. It's not solution sheets anymore. It's, customer ready, competitive analyses. It's objection handling, and it really pulls you, I think, much further through those 6 buying decisions than you would otherwise go.
Yep. Agreed. Doug, you've talked about the importance of having a content strategy and how painful it can be if you don't. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, heck, even as an early stage company, you need to have somebody that's thinking about content and responsible for content. You don't necessarily need to hire a VP of content marketing just yet, but you need someone thinking about what is our overall content strategy. If it's so important to how we articulate who we are and our view of the world and the value that we deliver to our customers and prospects, then why isn't it elevated up to a senior level position, as John had mentioned earlier? I totally agree with that, and I love that. I think a content strategy, even at a startup stage, is like, okay, who are we creating this content for? I.e., back to what John's comment before, like what's their journey? How do we ensure that we have assets that connects to each one of our personas at every step of the journey? How are we going to deliver this content? What's our tool and technology strategy? Sean was talking about this before, whether you're using Guru or what other tools, Slack, to get it out. I think also, by the way, part of content strategy with tools and technology is like, what's the best way to deliver the content? Is it via LinkedIn? Is it video? Is it calls? Is it text? Like, part of the content strategy needs to be not just like, here are assets that we're building for you, sales organization and customer success and CSMs. It's more like, hey, what do I use if I'm writing an email? What do I use if I'm actually sharing a LinkedIn post? What are some things that I can use if I'm actually in the middle of a presentation? What are things that I can pull out of my back pocket on my phone? I think being really thoughtful about the delivery mechanisms of your content. And then of course, as I mentioned this before, you got to make sure that all the assets you're creating have an owner so that they can maintain those assets to ensure that they're up to date, because content gets stale. I mean, in some cases in days.
Doug,
so
how many times
content strategy is like thinking through all of that.
And then it's like, I like the idea of having an overall owner too, Doug. I mean, how many times have you seen the owner of a piece of content have departed the company 9 months ago, right? So it's like, I think totally. Having somebody that's just that police person across everything, I think is just so critical, and making all those wheels work. And it's a hard role to budget for, but if you do it right, it's good. And I think also, to your point, like understanding what those pillars of content are and coalescing everyone around those things versus just volumes of content is really important as well.
Well, and also too, I mean, so along with the auditing process that you need to do with their content on a regular basis, or if you products like Guru actually have that, where there's a sync in there and there's a calendar notification, all that. But outside of auditing, you also need to make sure that there's consistency. I'm sure John's thinking about this too. It's like, hey, you've got templates, like where people are communicating, using content to communicate your brand and your perspective and your point of view. Just make sure there's consistency, whether that's look and feel or the message itself, right? As a sales professional wrapped in a marketer's body, I mean, those things just make my skin crawl when I see a sales rep try and hack together a bunch of slides to create something that they wanted to share, and it just doesn't fit at all. It can be really distracting.
Powerful. Let's talk about the evolution of the buyer journey. I think it's one we're really passionate about when we got together and prepped for this. You hear the words PLG, buyer-led. As we talked a little bit about how buyers are influenced in the sales process and they know what they want. I'm curious what each of us thinks about the changes that are going to be coming from this. Sean, maybe let's start with you. You shared a comment that it was intriguing to me of sales is fading. In a PLG world, is content still king, or do you see the investment in the product more important? Like if you have $1 to spend, are you putting it towards content or product? And with that, let me kind of turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Andy. And first, maybe I could set the table a bit as we dig into this conversation, because this is important. Now, just for some context, this was 21 and in 22 and moving into 23. There are some simple facts that are obviously driven by today's pandemic in the way that we're buying and selling and could change again. But where we are right now, and I mentioned the research conducted by Gartner a little bit earlier, but let me go a bit deeper. 45% of the buyer journey, they're researching online, talking to peers, crowdsourcing, going to analyst sites, things of that nature, going to your website. So half of it they're doing on their own. Here's something that's even a little bit more urgent. 44% of millennial buyers, which, oh, by the way, will be pretty much all buyers in the next 2 years. 44% of millennial buyers prefer a seller-free engagement. Now, the good news for us sales professionals is that buyer remorse, as I mentioned earlier, it continues to spike up. So there is a great need for sellers. At the same time, what we do with the limited time that we have in front of the buyer is what matters. So our craft is reshaping itself during these times, during what we're doing right now. So getting back to what I mentioned earlier, the buyer is spending 17% of their time with potential partners. And you got to split that 17% up with your competitors, unfortunately. So there are three key takeaways, as I imagine, what's shifting in this buyer-led when it's addressed to content. First, how do you, this is not a word, how do you unteach? How do you unteach what they think that they know to reduce their buyer remorse in using unique differentiators on what you're offering versus what the competitors may or may not do? The second, Doug mentioned this earlier, keep it simple. You must keep it simple. Make yourself easy to buy. And then third, reframing the problem that they're not thinking about. What's the problem behind the problem? They may be going out to purchase a CMS, but the real problem they have is they have a lack of coordination internally. Bring out that problem in your content. And that, again, is later stage. Going back to the mistakes that we had talked about just a few minutes ago, a big mistake in content generation is we imagined a content generation is for top of funnel or driving different types of NPS for customer adoption. Those are still accurate. That's still fine. But don't lose sight of the late stage buyer, both in the SMB all the way up to the enterprise, and making that content unteach, keep it simple, and reframing the problem. Because we don't know when buyers are shopping. And so you got to inject yourself in those later stage cycles. And that's one of the more provocative and exciting changes in selling today.
Powerful. Yeah, I love it. Doug, over to you. Is the traditional buyer journey changing, and how's that going to impact content?
Oh man, I want to talk PLG here for a second. I mean, is the traditional buyer journey changing? Of course it is. It's always evolving, but underneath it all, it's still the same. You know, I start thinking about a problem. If I'm a buyer, I start thinking about it. Like, this would be interesting. Or I noticed something. I talk to somebody else. I start talking to my peers. What have you done? Then I start to evaluate, well, how does this fit into my priorities? And then I start to evaluate my options. And I start to look for, what's out there. And then I may make a decision or not. Like at the end of the day, those 5 stages or the 6 that, John had mentioned earlier, that shit hasn't changed, 500 years. That's what we all go through. Things like PLG and these demo platforms, to me, are accelerating more at the top of the funnel. It's a way in which people can get access or into the value of your product, identify or realize value of your product faster and sooner. But at the end of the day, what's invariably going to happen once they realize a certain amount of value or there's a certain trigger there, someone's going to reach out and engage with them. Be like, hey, want to help you understand? I mean, Tesla, every new modern car company is doing this. Like, hey, realize you're only using 10% of your car. You're only using 10% of the product. Let me show you how to get more value out of it. By the way, who else might be interested in? So now all of a sudden we're back now into a buyer's cycle, but how we got there is different than the traditional sales and marketing channels, right? That we normally would do, create an ad campaign, someone raises their hand, SDR follows up with them. So I think, PLG is clearly, no question, the new way of which people are going to get access to products. There's no question. I think it's the most important kind of new go-to-market motion that we've seen in a long time. But at the end of the day, it's still a big part of top of the funnel activity. Because once someone starts to get enough value out of the product, then a salesperson is going to get involved, customer success is going to get involved. You're focusing on helping them to drive more adoption and usage of the product. So, I think we just have to be careful not to try and overcomplicate things, and just be mindful about the fact that, like, look, your customers are going to be educated. So in every single interaction that you have with a customer, regardless of where they are in their journey, recognize where they might be, have a hypothesis or point of view about them and their company, their business, and also recognize the fact that, they've likely done some element of homework. Not rocket science.
Yep. John, at Demandbase, you guys are probably sitting there with a unique window on how marketing is changing and content with it. How are you seeing this evolution of the buyer journey?
Yeah, I want to talk about the evolution of how people are thinking about, an account-based go-to-market, account-based marketing. I and a lot of people have traditionally used the analogy that this go-to-market is like fishing with spears. You go hunt the big fish that you want to go after, and you go after them with a spear. And what I realized in this world where the buyer is in increasingly control of their journey, it doesn't feel good to get poked by a spear. And what we need is kind of an evolution of something that takes that precision and targeting of the classic account-based model, but kind of brings a greater respect for the customer experience and the buyer experience. One of the great things about inbound marketing is that we don't call leads that aren't ready to be spoken to, right? We call them when they're actually ready. So, I've been talking a lot about the concept of account-based experience instead of account-based marketing. So ABX instead of ABM, because it brings that respect for the buyer journey, to the top of the equation. And in many ways, it's about aligning your go-to-market against where that buyer actually is, and using different tactics and different strategies and different content to engage them where they are instead of poking them with the spear. So I think this is a pretty fundamental change in how not just marketers, but companies practice account-based, driven by this.
Yeah, that's a powerful quote. I hadn't heard that one before. I'd say, just from my quick perspective on this, is if the first time you're learning about a product is a viral share, I think content fundamentally changes. I think a lot of people like to use the term PLG, and maybe not as many models are PLG as people may profess to the world. But if you do have a pure PLG type motion, it's really interesting, right? Like, the product becomes potentially your primary distribution channel for content, right? Like at Culture Amp, we'd say, great, we have people learning how to manage the culture and companies working together, but we'd start to throw in training courses on how to be better managers, and you can start to engage your people in some really interesting ways. So I definitely think it is for a subset of companies that are true PLG, and many are not. It can be very revolutionary, this new concept. Terrific. We've got 12 minutes left. I'm sure we'll need a minute or two to wrap it up. So figure 10 minutes. We've got a couple Q&A questions. And again, people feel free to keep posting in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. If not, I'm sure, feel free to drop us notes, and we can wrap up at the end with how people can follow us and learn more on the content. Let's see. We're going to go ahead and take one here, which talks about, I'll just read it verbatim, and then we can figure out if whoever wants to raise their hand to take it. Say you're not a well-oiled machine or a large business. What advice do you have for folks trying to validate what content does and doesn't work? How would you tailor your advice for smaller businesses? So maybe I'll tighten that up a little bit and say, all of us have worked at bigger companies. How could we what's the most relevant pieces of this if somebody's a startup? And I'm happy to take first, or Sean, it looked like you were going for it. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for submitting the question. It's a great question. And just for that context, I also have worked at both big companies and small Series B software companies. And it still goes back to, say, the comment earlier about context and why you create content in the first place. And I mentioned these 3 validations to measure if it is working. So for you, you're at a smaller organization, you want to see if your content is working. First, check internal. And if you have a certification-based organization, and you should, ensure that you have a high pass rate on the content that you're generating. Are your people talking about it in the right ways? The messaging working? Is it inspiring? So that'd be first. Second, measure if it's being used. So measure if that content is out in the market, Is it getting downloaded? Is there engagement on the assets? Measure if it's actually getting used. And then third, if you can, once you get post-sale, measuring buyer satisfaction versus remorse. Were you generating the right content that got in the market in the first place? So those are the 3 areas that I would advise you to go to.
I'd say I'm now at a startup. I haven't been at big companies, so I can talk a little bit about it. I think as a small company, you've got this unique advantage, which is you can figure out what's your superpower, what's unique about your company versus just running the same playbook that everyone runs. So rather than just building out this behemoth of a content team that writes a bunch of SEO content, think, what do you do uniquely? So there's actually one of the sponsors, Blueboard, that's sponsoring this whole event that I was riffing with their go-to-market team. They give people experiences to be able to, like, they allow employers to give employees experiences. Like, every one of those employees has an amazing, mind-blowing experience. Like, that's your content engine. And it's unique and differentiated versus hiring a bunch of people that can write. And so when I talk to people, and I think one of the observations I've had is, if somebody's just going to take the same playbook from their last company and put it on yours, run. Go find somebody that's really going to sit down and think, like, what's unique about you and how do you leverage that? And bigger companies, it's hard, right? Like, if you show up and you're running marketing at a larger company, it's hard to steer that ship. But at a small company, like, you can do some pretty cool things. We're doing some of that at Gated as well. Anyone else thoughts on small companies before I shift to the next one? No. Let me see here. We've touched a little bit on this one, but the question asks, any tips on asking for content contributions from prospects and customers? That's an interesting one. I think we've touched a lot on customers. I don't know if anyone here has dealt with prospect content.
I mean, one thing that we do, which is interesting in that context, is we run a podcast, which is meant to be educational to the marketplace. But I will say we explicitly target key decision makers at prospect companies to be the guests on the podcast. And part of the reason why that is, it helps create the right content, but also it helps us start to build a relationship in a very subtle, soft way with the target, the person that we actually want to build a relationship with.
That's powerful, John. Yeah, it's like, it feels in the last year and a half or so, everybody and their brother has started a podcast. But I totally agree. It's like, it's a perfectly built excuse to reach out to prominent target prospects and get them talking around your brand and engaged. It's so powerful. I'm curious, like, do people feel like, since we're on the topic of content, have podcasts like jumped the shark? If they gotten are there too many podcasts, or how do you think about that?
Too many.
Yeah.
I don't even know what to listen to these days, let alone read.
Yep. Well, again, you're sort of, subtly, that's sort of missing the point of what we're doing with our podcast. Right.
Yep.
And the reality is we do, when people do listen to it, right. It creates content we can repurpose, but it's not the primary goal.
Yeah. No, the primary goal is engaging prospects, right, John? Yeah. Is that how you look at it?
Yeah.
I would imagine a couple of things. Number one, I think if you're going to start a podcast, be super, super targeted and focused as far as like, who's your audience and what do you really want to talk about? I feel like there's a lot of podcasts that's just like, let's just talk about sales. Oh gosh, really? Like, all right, well, that's such a huge topic. Same thing. Like, let's just talk about marketing. It's like, let's be a little bit more focused and targeted. And then the other thing is too, I mean, John, you've got pull, man. You're like a seasoned vet in the world of marketing, and you've done this so many times. And so, like, if I were in the world of marketing, I'd want to listen to you. And I want to pay attention to you. I think when I say there's too many podcasts out there, because there's a lot of people out there that have a podcast that one, on it, in my own personal opinion, they shouldn't, because I wouldn't listen to them because they don't have enough experience to actually have a point of view, unless they can pull in an amazing audience. And then number two, it's like, again, who are you targeting? What am I going to learn here? And I find just far too many podcasts out there are just too generic and nebulous.
I'd agree with you, Doug. Like, the best podcasts I'm on are the ones that they've got a very specific question and a specific structure versus, I mean, it's fun to get on the ones where you riff, but it's easy and there's no prep required. But the ones that I've always found the most valuable, the ones that like push me to think and prep, and they challenge me with a specific question.
Agreed.
Totally.
Sasser's doing a good job with their podcast, but getting back to John's point with prospect-driven content, the idea of building community with the purpose of thought leadership to drive attraction to your brand and targeting prospects that should be your customer to engage is a brilliant strategy. And it works. And then echo what Doug said, so long as you have purpose, intelligent content, and it's interesting. But it's a great strategy to get prospect content.
That's amazing. Well, guys, thank you for joining. I think maybe let's just wrap up really quickly, which is, if people want to follow your content and your company's content, where do they go? Sean, go ahead and start, and then we'll just roll around the room.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So I'm with Greenhouse Software, and we help companies hire for what's next. You can engage with Greenhouse on both LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, on our website. With me personally, I'm more active on LinkedIn and publishing content. And thank you all for the opportunity and for engaging in the discussion. Thanks, MSP. I miss you.
John, go ahead.
Demandbase.com. Tons of awesome resources, including my book, The Clear and Complete Guide to Account-Based Experience, and DBTV, which is, we believe, the first B2B streaming channel.
And Doug, how about yourself?
Rad. I love it. Yeah, by the way, Demandbase does put out great content. So nice work, John.
Thank you, Doug.
And since y'all bought Inside View, we're family still. You and me. You and me. Because I keep getting the Demandbase updates, which is great. Congrats on the growth and success. I mean, similar to Sean, I post most of my content on LinkedIn. At Emergence Capital, we're at mcap.com. We've got a thoughts page if you want to read about up to date, our perspective on what's going on in the world of startups. We invest in Series A, B stage, B2B enterprise SaaS companies: Zoom, Salesforce, Box, Yammer, Viva, SalesLoft. Happy about. Thank you, Vista. Congratulations, Sean. And Box, actually, Andy. That's how I got connected to MCAP folks. But yeah, give us all a follow.
That's cool. And for me, it's you can go to gated.com. We help solve the problem of irrelevant email. And I'll go a little bolder and say anyone can email me at andy@gated.com. I email away. I'm comfortable putting my email out there because it is gated. If you want to know what that means, check it out and learn a little bit more. So I think somebody's going to pop back in to wrap this thing up for us, Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Andy, Doug, Sean.
Andy, that was the best. Andy, that was the best little snippet for your company by dropping your email address, because people will learn about Gated by trying to get in touch with you. I love that. Well done.
Oh, Doug, I got to get you Gated, all three of you guys at some point. So we're coming for you.
I'm in.
Awesome. All right. Thank you to our moderators and our speakers. This was really amazing. You got us energized for the rest of the summit, which was awesome. Our next event is the VC panel. I just dropped a link to the rest of the registration page. If you are not registered for the event, if you are, you're going to check your calendar and you're going to get that personal link that you have and hop on Goldcast again. Don't forget to show our sponsors some love in the booths up top and explore Goldcast. And thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. Bye.